What the hell does coal have to do with catastrophism? Now, I already answered that question in the video that leads up to this video. So go watch that video really fast if you want a little bit of an in-depth explanation as to why coal is intrinsically important to understanding catastrophism on this planet. Now, it's important to remember that I am not talking about catastrophes that may have happened 100 billion years ago, or 10 billion years ago, or whatever crazy stuff that geologists nowadays like to claim. We're not talking about any of that. All right, the cataclysms that we are talking about happened in the memory of mankind. So that's okay. Anyway, so why does coal matter to that? Doesn't coal take a bajillion years to form? What the hell does this have to do with history of only a few thousand years ago? Well, it has everything to do with our relatively recent history. Sounds boring, right? And I agree. So I'm going to stop this video, and then we can all go get a life and do something more productive with our time. I'm just kidding. No, I'm just kidding. We're not going to stop the video because I have nothing else going on right now in my life for the next couple of hours. And I feel that I have become exceedingly talented in wasting other people's time as well as my own. With that said, let us dive into the unbelievably fascinating and exciting realm that is coal. Yes, I am talking about that crap that we burn for energy or that comes into our stockings when we have been bad people. Now, why are we going to waste our time talking about coal? And why is it fascinating at all? And what does it have to do with our ancient history? Interestingly enough, it has everything to do with our ancient history. But why? Why would we waste our time checking coal in relation to our ancient ancestors and what happened to them in the past? Well, here's the deal. One of the amazing things that has happened in coal mines in the past few hundred years that we've been mining it is that we have stumbled upon weird objects actually embedded within these coal seams. What happens is that miners, they're obviously mining for coal and they're going down there and they're picking away. And every once in a while, for whatever reason, they're mining hundreds of feet under the earth to get at this coal, like anthracite, for example. And when they break open, like a rock of coal or a bunch of coal, every once in a while, some weird artifact will pop out. That is insane. The fact that we find ancient artifacts inside coal, that right there is enough and should have been enough for all historians to put the brakes on everything they thought they knew. In every direction they were already going, every single historian should have stopped right there and did everything they possibly could using the scientific method to try and figure out why we are finding all of these weird ancient artifacts embedded in these coal seams. I mean, this really should have been a huge wake-up call, not just to historians and archaeologists. It should have been a wake-up call to every single person on this planet. And interestingly enough, it wasn't. Everybody essentially ignores all of these insane artifacts that we find embedded in coal. Now, why is it weird that why would we even take that approach? If you're asking that question, that's a good question. Let me give you a quick, short synopsis. I covered this in much more detail in the video that preceded this one, but here, let's just go over it really fast as a refresher. So, geologists believe generally that it takes tens or hundreds of millions of years to create seams of coal. All right. And that process basically just involves heat and pressure. And then over time, magically, coal will appear. Right. That's an extremely basic overview of how mainstream believes coal is created. But the reality is the process, when you look at it in any kind of detail, it's hypocritical and it does not make any sense. And like I said, I've already covered that in a different video. So we're just going to keep moving on. I'm going to get to the point in this video this time. All right. So if coal takes 100 million years to form, one of the seams of coal, like a layer of coal, why is it that we are finding man-made metal objects embedded in this 100 million year coal. How is that even possible? And these objects, there is no reason to believe that these objects that we are finding embedded in the coal are 100 million years old. There's no reason to believe that at all. Unfortunately, what has happened though is that there is a certain school of thought in the alternative research community that actually takes the mainstream geological processes seriously. Like, they actually believe the mainstream process in this area, and the reason why is because their own theories are stating something to the tune of, yeah, man existed 100 million years ago. This is when the Atlanteans were flying around. And then, we find an object embedded in coal, and then suddenly that entire alternative research group is like, see, I told you. See, look at that. Mainstream dates it to 100 million years ago. It takes 100 million years to make coal, so this object has to be 100 million years old, which then, of course, is proof for that particular school of thought. That could not be more wrong. In the previous video, we went over the scientific fact. This is based on nothing but science. There's no hearsay here. There's no theory here. We know for a scientific fact that coal can be created in an instant, or in just a few minutes. It really does not take all that much time to create the coal that we now mine. So if coal can actually be created instantly or only in a few minutes, what that means is that we no longer have to adhere to these 100 million year dates for these anachronistic objects. We don't have to do that because there's no reason to believe that those coal seams formed over that period of time. And as I've already said, and it bears repeating, if you look at how the mainstream believes coal forms, and then you look at the actual seams and layers of coal that we find geologically, the mainstream theory on how coal is formed is immediately thrown out the window. It has to be. What's interesting about what we find physically, observational evidence, that's important. So what we actually find geologically is that all of these coal seams that have been found could not have formed in the time span that the Earth has been supposedly in existence. It's funny, you literally need more time. The geologists, mainstream geologists, they actually need more time than the Earth has ever existed to explain the coal seams that we have found right now. And that's just the ones that we know about. Right? We don't know where all the coal is there, and there's probably even deeper coal out there. We have no idea. The main point here is that the mainstream literally does not have Earth existing long enough to create all of the coal that we find. So I only go over all of this garbage because it's really important to understand that the mainstream is a true religion. Like, people who believe that coal took 100 million years to form, they've lost their minds. I mean, they're absolutely insane. You think this channel's crazy? No. We are pillars of sanity compared to the mainstream geologists. It's crazy. It's okay. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us in a very interesting scientific position. What we now can say is that when we find out-of-place artifacts embedded in coal, we can now look at those artifacts in an entirely new light and think to ourselves, okay, hey, look, if it does not take 100 million years to create this particular seam that we find an object in, the next question has to be, okay, fine, we can do that, but where the hell did the coal come from then? How do we then date a coal seam if the theory of taking millions of years does not work? Now what do we do? Well, I don't have an exact answer because this is where things can get a little murky. And it should be murky. Why should it be murky? Here's the reality. As we begin to look back and take our ancestors' histories and mythologies and all of that stuff seriously, what do we find? Well, we find planet-wide catastrophes taking place on Earth. And as our ancestors make very clear, these catastrophes bring in with them all kinds of destruction. We have destruction from hurricanes. We have destruction from water. We also find destruction of fire. Now, this is key. Actually, both destruction by fire and destruction by water, these are the two key ingredients for creating coal seams instantaneously, or almost instantaneously. Pretty damn quick. Same day coal. All right. So I covered this in the earlier video, but as a recap really fast, our ancestors, they state that at certain periods of time, fire rained down from the sky. Now, on the surface, this claim might seem easily explained by, say, a volcano or something like that. And that is generally what the mainstream historians and archaeologists will roll with. They will simply say that our ancestors were too stupid to understand that a volcano would be throwing up, lava and, quote unquote, fireballs or balls of lava flying through the air. That happens. Like, we know that happens. But mainstream holds the position that our ancestors were too stupid to understand that a volcano was throwing all of this stuff into the sky, and instead thought that the sky was simply raining fire. This is an incredibly dumb position to take. I don't care what side of the arguments you fall on. Our ancestors were not stupid. When they say that fire rained down from the sky, that is what they mean. Even more interesting, they tell us how the fire rained down from the sky, don't they? They say the gods rained fire down from the sky. Now, of course, on this channel, all we do is we replace the word God with planet, and suddenly, cosmologically, things start to make scientific sense. So if the Earth had a close encounter with a planetary or cometary body, and that particular body is inundated or at least contains a certain amount of hydrocarbons on its surface, then it is not a stretch of the imagination that there could have been a transfer of those hydrocarbons from that body down to the Earth. Now, that's kind of a crazy claim. First things first, you're probably thinking, wait, you're telling me hydrocarbons are on planets? What the hell are you talking about? And yes, even mainstream admits, NASA, this is straight from NASA, right? This is one of the most corrupt organizations you can imagine. Even they wholeheartedly admit that there are bodies out there just full of hydrocarbons, right? Titan's a good one. Comet Halley, that thing has just hundreds or not, if not thousands of barrels of hydrocarbons on it. So hydrocarbons exist in our solar system. If Earth came close to one of these bodies, then we find that it is scientifically possible that there was an exchange of matter between these two cosmological bodies. Now, you might next be wondering, like, all right, fine, so you're saying that Earth had encounters with comets, all right, fine, but also planets? And yes, like that is the claim. And the reason why we make that claim is extremely simple. That is what our ancestors tell us. Now, I'm not going to get too far into that. We've covered stuff like that before, but we're just going to focus on where did the fire raining down on Earth come from? All right, so let's just follow what our ancestors told us happened back in the day, and they are very, very clear about it. For example, we have cultures in the Middle Eastern area and in the South American area that are very clear when they say they found bituminous material raining down on them from the sky. Bituminous material being stuff like asphalt and oil, right? So this is what our ancestors claim. This is not some weird schizo, theory by some dude on the internet who that's not what it is. Our ancestors make it very clear that a sticky black substance rained down on them during a very particular time of a catastrophic event. All right. So if you're wondering where can we get the fuel for a fire, we've now got it. Hydrocarbons are the perfect fuel, and we know it exists scientifically in space on other planetary and cometary bodies. And then we have the corroboration of our ancestors saying that those cosmological bodies did indeed come close to Earth, and then that is when they had to deal with the raining down of hydrocarbons. Now, if we have hydrocarbons entering Earth's atmosphere, what happens when stuff enters an atmosphere? Right? It creates friction. What is that friction going to do to a substance that is highly flammable and, more importantly, surrounded by oxygen? Correct. If you guessed it, fire. That is how you get fire raining down onto planet Earth en masse back in the day. And our ancestors lived through it. Well, some of our ancestors did. A lot of people did not live through this, by the way. Please believe and please remember that quite a few civilizations were probably wiped out during these periods of raining fire, right? This was not a happy time. It's not like people were sitting there just kind of watching a show going on up in space. No, this literally wipes out entire cultures and ruins entire sections of continents. So this is a problem. This is a serious issue. And it's the reason why our ancestors talk about it, because it literally destroyed civilization. All right, so we can prove that fire can rain down from space. Great, we're done. So what the hell does that have to do with coal? All right, so here's the deal. What we need is we need a source of heat to begin the process of making coal out of biological material. That is a similar requirement that we need, just like the mainstream needs it. The only difference here is that we don't need pressure. We just need to get all of this biological material heated up and burned really quick, and then almost immediately the fires have to be put out before the organic mass is completely, engulfed in the fire. Oh, and by the way, the reason why the fire part is important also is because that is what we scientifically right now observe in nature creating stuff like charcoal. You can make charcoal right now on your own using fire, right? You can do all that stuff. It does not take 10 million years to make a kind of coal, charcoal. So this is not weird. But if we're going to light something on fire, the other part of this is that we have to extinguish it. It has to be taken out, and it has to be taken out quick. So how the hell do we extinguish a massive forest or tropical jungle just absolutely being drenched and burned by oil? It's got to happen quick. One more thing, actually. So the forests or the jungles that this fire is raining down upon, they aren't like jungles and forests that we see today, more or less. What I mean by that is that we know for a fact, just a few thousand years ago, Earth was a much more lush and biologically fruitful environment. So these forests and these jungles that are being inundated with fire, they are generally different than what we see today, at least as far as general density goes. Now that's important. The reason why it's important is because the coal seams that we do find, they can be hundreds of feet thick. Right? These coal seams are no joke. So you would need a lot of biological material to really get the 100+ foot coal seams that we find. And sure enough, back in the day, we have those lush environments. So I just wanted to make sure everybody understands that this happened. Earth was a completely different environment just a few thousand years ago, and that is proven by science. Nobody argues that, right? And there's no one in the mainstream that is really going to come out and talk crap about that. So that's another point, scientific point, that the mainstream has that we can use in our favor. All right, anyway, so we find ourselves with these jungles and these forests being inundated with flames. We have got to extinguish these flames quickly, almost immediately. Otherwise, all of that stuff is just going to become ash. How do we do that? Well, once again, we can go back and read what our ancestors said happened. They just tell us. It's not even a mystery. This is why mainstream history is hilarious. Our ancestors already recorded all of this stuff, and it's completely ignored. Anyway, our ancestors give us the answer. They say, hey, look, the fire rained down, and then following that fire raining down on us, huge floods then engulfed these areas. So if we have a huge forest on fire, and all of a sudden a huge wall of water washes over it all, instantly all of that stuff is put out, right? That is where we get our coal. Now, when the water rushes in, it's also bringing all of that sediment and stuff like that, right? And then you're going to have very quick layering. Once again, quick sedimentation is a part of real geology. It does not take millions and billions of years to create strata. You can create strata in mere minutes. all you need is a ton of water. And sure enough, we have a ton of water. So this will coincide with some of the observations that even mainstream tries to say happen. Because even the mainstream has to say, hey, look, you know, a bunch of water has to, you know, basically sit on top of all of this organic material, acidic water, apparently. And then, you know, suddenly coal will appear over 100 million years. You still need a ton of water. Anyway, that's where alternative science, real science, let's call it what it is. All right, so basically what this does is that all of these findings geologically with the coal, they are perfectly synonymous with our ancestors' recordings of catastrophic events. And these events only took place a few thousand years ago. So, let's get back to the coal and the artifacts that we find in the coal. If coal seams do not take 100 million years to create, that then will start to help make sense of the objects that we find buried within coal. Because here's the deal. If we have forests and jungles being inundated with, you know, this coal making process, right, burning and all of that, we can pretty much almost guarantee that there are humans living in these environments. So it's not just trees that are burning and not just animals, but humans and human civilization as well. So we would, if any of this catastrophism garbage is real, we would expect to find objects within coal seams. In fact, if we did not find these objects within coal seams, that actually puts us in a completely different scientific position. Then that would actually take away from catastrophism. But what's interesting is that we find the exact opposite, don't we? We should expect to find relics from an ancient human past buried in these coal seams if our ancestors are telling the truth. And sure enough, what do we find? That's exactly what we find. We find objects from some unknown civilizations buried within coal that the mainstream thinks is 100 million years old, right? We don't need any of that. All right, so let's get into some of these objects. I know I've been talking for like 10 million years, kind of going over a recap, but it is fundamentally important to understand that if we are going to make claims that catastrophism is real, then we should expect to find certain pieces of evidence that would initially be weird, but we would need those to substantiate the claim. And sure enough, that is precisely what we find. So that's why it's important to remember this. This is why taking catastrophism seriously, taking all of that stuff that our ancestors talked about seriously is so important. It is a scientifically viable position. Okay, let's get into the objects. I'm going to go over some of the objects and let's see if we can't maybe even figure out where they're actually from. I don't know. Let's do this. All right. Now, I realize that there is probably like a million videos out there that kind of cover these artifacts, but those videos only ever cover these artifacts in like a, ooh, so weird and spooky, and then they move on, right? They just want their views of the top 10, and then they move on. We're not going to do that. Let's see if we can't extrapolate some information from some of this stuff and maybe even place it in an actual civilization. All right, moving on. Let's get to our first object. Our first object will be an iron pot that was found in coal. So here's the little blurb. So in 1912, 2 employees who were shoveling coal in the municipal electric plant in Thomas, Oklahoma, broke apart a larger chunk for the furnaces when, to the surprise of both men, an iron pot fell out of the chunk. Several experts subsequently examined the iron pot, and it was declared to be genuine. The imprint of the pot could also still be clearly seen in the broken chunks of coal that had encased it. According to Robert O. Fay of the Oklahoma Geological Survey, the Wilburton mine coal in which the pot was found is about 312 million years old. See, that's what I'm talking about. They honestly believe that this iron pot is 312 million years old. You're insane. Like there's literally no reason to even believe that. All right, so what's the evidence that we have here? So we have an iron pot found in the United States in the Oklahoma area. let's put on our scientific method caps and our critical thinking cloak, and let's see if we can't deduce something here. All right, so it's in the United States. One of the problems we immediately are going to run into is that if you look at the mainstream chronology and how they believe stuff went, there really shouldn't have been anybody making anything with iron basically pre-colonialism, sort of. I guess you can make, yeah, in North America, I can't really think of any mainstream culture that would have been dealing in and manipulating iron. Like, what culture would be doing that? None of the Native Americans up here, none of the North American Indians lay any claim to this kind of a situation. We don't find iron pots or iron anything really in any of the North American Indians' possessions. They just really didn't have any of that. And any little trinket that they did have that didn't really seem something that North American Indians would have had, they didn't make it, right? It's a trinket that they stumbled upon and found. It's just like a few of the copper artifacts that the North American Indians had in their possession. They lay no claim to fabricating or mining any of that stuff, right? They didn't do it. There's no evidence for it in the first place. But second of all, even they said it was just something that they found left over from a more ancient civilization. All right. So even the North American Indians I don't even want to use that term. Their stories, their histories literally claim that there were people there before them. Interestingly enough, some of those people happen to be giants. That's their story. Don't look at me. That's their story. Now, this pot doesn't necessarily look like a giant would have been using it, but, I don't know what it was used for. I have no clue what it was used for. It's possible. Okay, but then the next question comes, what catastrophe would have been the culprit for creating this particular coal seam? This is where things can get a little weird. We know that there were conflagrations on the North American continent. The North American Indians, they too have these stories. The question is, which catastrophe is the creator? All right, so we know that there's multiple times, by the way, to where we have massive flooding and massive conflagrations. Like that's just something that's a fact. We don't just have one event. So that's another thing that is going to make things difficult to try and date this particular iron pot. But at the very least, what we can do is we can eliminate any of the North American Indians taking claim to it. They don't lay claim to it anyway. I mean, they don't say anything like that. So let's follow the thread that they do give us. They do have the claim that there were other civilizations in North America before they arrived. Now, that's interesting in and of itself, right? How often does the mainstream talk about that, right? They don't. They never do. And they can't, especially in today's world. And they never will. But anyways, it's the truth. That's their story. So is it that civilization that predates them that had the iron pot created? Yeah, maybe. And that's where things start to get a little murky, because here's what happened. I mean, at some point in time, North America gets wiped clean by one hell of a flood. And flood is probably not quite the right term. I suppose we could really say a huge mountain of water is the real term that should be used for one of the major floods that would have wiped out North American civilizations. And sure enough, that's once again what North American Indians have in their mythologies. So what I would say is this pot probably belonged to whatever civilization. Well, I don't know. It could have been an even earlier civilization. Here's the problem with coal seams. You can generally find, one kind of coal seam built on top of another kind of coal seam. And those coal seams would have been created not millions of years apart, but they would have been created, 500, 600, maybe 1,000 years apart per seam. The question is, which major event would have taken out the civilization that made iron pots? This is a tough one. All right, so iron in itself is interesting, because one of the problems with iron showing up... okay, all right. So there actually is a real problem with the way mainstream chronology looks at human development in the recent past. By that I mean everybody is familiar with that age-old adage of, Stone Age, Copper Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, etc. Right? Like that's a very, very clean progression. What people don't ever question is, why did the Bronze Age precede the Iron Age? And if you don't know why, it's actually a very interesting problem. The reality is iron is much more easier to work with. Iron, you have to make the furnaces a little hotter, yes, but relative to making bronze, it's not as in depth, right? To make bronze, you have to add tin to your copper in the correct ratio, and you have to go through, there's a process there. There's much more of a process to create bronze than there is iron. So it begs the question, why did they favor bronze over iron? It gets even weirder because we know for a fact that a lot of the iron that is initially used, it's very rarely mined, right? A lot of the iron that our ancestors used when the Iron Age finally came around, that stuff was basically just on the surface scattered around Earth. I mean, that was it. It wasn't like people had to set up huge mining operations to begin to work with and extract iron from the ore. So what the hell's going on? Here's what's interesting. And actually, this is a good bullet point. I don't have an answer, by the way, where this pot's found. But what we can say is this. Whoever was working with iron probably existed after the Venus event. This would have put, in mainstream chronology, that probably would have put this civilization around the 1500s to the 1700s BCE. Now, why are we dating this because of iron? Here's the deal. The reason why the Bronze Age comes before the Iron Age is because iron wasn't readily available until after Earth has one of its catastrophic close encounters with Venus. What happens when Venus does a close flyby to Earth during that 1700 to 1500-ish BC time is that Venus goes into ultimate comet mode. So while Venus is in comet mode, what's happening is all of its material is being ejected off of the surface of Venus, going into the tail, all through, electromagnetism and all of that stuff. We're not going to get into that. Just roll with me, all right? Venus was a comet, and it starts basically shooting out iron bits. And of course, at one point in time, well, a couple times maybe, but one of the points in time is that Earth runs through Venus's cometary tail. Venus's cometary tail was saturated with iron fragments. So what happens? Earth gets rained iron down from all over the place. So suddenly you have a surface of Earth that had no iron on the surface, or at least no iron that really mattered in the quantities that would have mattered, to suddenly having iron ore everywhere, and it's easily accessible now. This is what kicks off the Iron Age. This is why a lot of the times when you go and you'll read about an iron object, you will find that even mainstream science claims that it is meteoric iron. This is where that iron comes from. It comes from the surface of Venus. And there are probably other areas as well, or other events that did minor drops as well onto Earth. But Venus is the main culprit here. So, if we have a culture working with iron, they probably came after the Venus event. Or they may have come during the Venus event, or they may have existed during the Venus event, and some of those people are the survivors. They were able to get their hands on some of that iron. They were able to cast the iron pot, and then Venus came around again and then wiped them out. Why do I say that Venus probably wiped them out? Well, because North America gets hit extraordinarily hard by the Venus event. So there might have been a civilization there that lived through a couple of the encounters with Venus, was able to obtain some of that iron ore, manufacture it, because these people were not cavemen. The people who lived in North America during this period of time, they were no joke. These people were legitimate, high-level thinking humans. They were very much aware of technology. They could have created the iron pot, and this is maybe one of the reasons why we don't find tons of iron pots and stuff like that in America, because they did not have a whole ton of time to manufacture all kinds of artifacts. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if that's the case. Anyway, so during one of the Venus pass-bys, like I said, North America gets absolutely eliminated by a huge mountain of water. And this mountain of water would have been the mountain of water that extinguished the inferno that would have been first blazing on the North American continent as oil and stuff rained down, onto Earth. Then Venus drags over this huge mountain of water, extinguishes everything, but in the process, it also destroys and buries the civilization that created this iron pot. Yeah, I wonder, that's just kind of where an evidence trail can lead us. But it might make sense. Here, let's move on to the next object. Once again in North America, oddly enough. All right, so the next object we have is a brass bell that was found in a coal seam. So let me read a description about this really fast. In a discovery in 1944 that by now is almost becoming commonplace, very interesting, a man called Newton Anderson found this quaint brass bell inside a lump of coal that was mined near his house in West Virginia. Newton dropped the lump and it broke, revealing the bell encased inside. The bell underwent rigorous testing and was extensively analyzed at the University of Oklahoma and found to contain known metals, but mixed together in an unusual blend and quite different from modern alloys. So this is important. It's one thing to just find, a bell and be like, oh yeah, it's a metal bell, whatever. But it's even more interesting to note that not only are we finding a bell in a thing of coal, but the metallic composition, the mineral composition of this bell is completely foreign to how we do things nowadays or how other cultures generally did things. So what does this tell us? If we find an intricate object such as this, it tells us a few things actually. So let's look at it. The first thing is that it appears to be a normal sized bell for like, a little handbell. Use ding 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 ding. Okay, normal size. Not the reason why the normal size is important is because one of the problems that we run into with North American history is the giant situation. Right? This is an account by North American Indians. What do you want from me? They say they existed. I highly doubt that a giant was probably creating or molding a bell of this size for them. So it's probably a safe bet that whatever culture made this particular bell, it was a regular, normal human culture. But it would have been an advanced culture, predating the North American Indians. And once again, this jives with their stories. So that means, to be blunt, with just these two pieces of evidence, we can start to prove that North America has a completely different history than what is generally either taught or held as canon by those people up in high authoritative positions in academia. So that's a real problem, right? Because if their chronology is based on fabrications and lies, which basically they all are, and these people also ignore this kind of evidence, that's a problem. That is a scientific problem. We can't just ignore that. But people do. People ignore this, and then they say that, alternative researchers are crazy conspiracy theorists, when the mainstream is perpetuating some of the worst historical crimes against humanity you can imagine. All right, anyway, I love this stuff. Just with these two pieces of evidence and reading and looking back at North American Indian stories of the past, we actually get a completely different picture of what was going on in North America only a few thousand years ago. And it's nothing of what the mainstream currently holds dear. All right, fine. So you're saying, all right, fine, there is evidence for that. The North American Indians do corroborate it, and we do also have histories from around the world that would support the possibility of these kinds of catastrophes taking place. But, but is there any human evidence, any human remains? You would think that maybe, would maybe humans be encased in coal? Yes, sure enough, that is exactly what we find as well. I'll read you this. All right. Perhaps the most interesting of all was the discovery in the anthracite coalfields of Shamokin, Pennsylvania, in Northumberland County. an object mentioned by many newspapers throughout the state at the time in October of 1899 of a human head petrified, found on the number 3 level of the number 3 slope at the Cameron Colliery or mine, by miner George Miller and others. The Philadelphia Press remarked how the discovery is the most important to date of the many fossils and vegetable curiosities found in the anthracite coal beds. It's crazy. I love how even in this little part, it even talks about how many different findings that they are constantly discovering within these coal seams. Just crazy stuff. Anyway, they found a human skull. So that would mean that there was human habitation during the time period of this catastrophism. I mean, as if the objects themselves weren't enough proof. But here we have a fossilized human head. It's crazy. All of these findings should have literally turned the head of every single archaeologist on the planet, and every single one of them should have been doing everything they could possibly do to try to find answers. I mean, we have evidence right here of a higher level human habitation on North America, and it is completely ignored by the mainstream. Like, that's not how you do science. I mean, we don't. So you ever wonder why I just discard mainstream trash? Is because this is why. I mean, they don't follow the evidence. They don't use the scientific method. They're all hypocrites. So moving on. Interestingly enough, it's not just that a skull was found. Check this out. So they also found another skull that had its eye sockets broken and was found with other human bones and soft organs in Pennsylvania, and again in another anthracite vein. That's insane. Man, I wish I could find pictures of that. I mean, they are finding this human biological stuff that, according to mainstream, is 300 million years old. I mean, we have to immediately get rid of the hundreds of millions of years thing that mainstream constantly throws at us. If we are finding stuff like this, we have to move on. Like, we cannot hold on to coal being 100 million years old. It's not going to work. Anyway, the main point here with all this coal crap is just to show that if catastrophism happened, we would expect certain natural events to take place on Earth, coal formation being one of them, given what is described entailing in the catastrophes. And sure enough, here they are. And even better, we start to find artifacts from the civilizations that used to live during that period of time. Now, what it also tells us is that, only a few thousand years ago, our ancestors, even in North America, they were already advanced metallurgists. There were already all kinds of high-tech stuff taking place on, the continent of North America, but everywhere, obviously. But the coal is what helps prove it. What mainly helps prove that catastrophism is real. So if you've ever had any doubts, one of the pieces of evidence that we have are these artifacts that are found in coal. All right, so it just blows me away that mainstream completely ignores all of this factual evidence that really does support a completely different picture of what happened in our past. And why they ignore it, I mean, man. Anyway, okay, we get it. Anyway, let's wrap this up. I've talked enough about coal. The main point here of what this video is proving scientifically is that if we had major cataclysms in the way that our ancestors claim, we should find the kind of evidence that we do indeed find embedded in coal. Coal is an important piece of evidence to understand the entire catastrophic makeup of what happened in the past. So with this evidence in hand, we can take a look at North American history and we can say, hey, look, there was definitely more going on in the past than what mainstream especially is willing to admit to. But just in general, this is something that we have to take into account. We can no longer ignore these facts. But we also cannot use mainstream dating interpretations to scientifically place humans back 100 or 200 million or 300 million years ago. There's no reason to do any of that. And the reason why there's no reason to do any of that is very simple. Because we don't have to. I mean, the only reason why people date any of this stuff back millions of years ago is simply because the mainstream outlook on these kinds of sciences, in this case stratigraphy, and the coal seams found within, the only reason why people date this crap millions of years ago is not because we have a legitimate scientific dating method that is infallible, that can date things like this millions of years ago. No, the only reason why this stuff is dated the way it's dated is because a higher authority within a corrupt academic system has decided that that is the way that it is. And interestingly enough, then the system, or the academic system that ultimately answers to, other powers within a society, they promote that. Those people are not interested in promoting the truth, obviously. And if you can throw something back millions and millions of years back into the past, then that's just a level of obfuscation that, you can really do some serious damage, and you can exploit people by doing that. And that's exactly what's happened here with this coal stuff. Why are we finding these artifacts embedded in coal? What is this? I mean, you cannot see and find artifacts like this and then still think that coal takes millions of years to form. It doesn't work like that. It's so irritating. I mean, the reality is, objects that we're finding in coal, these particular kinds of objects, we have no reason to believe that they would even last that long encased in coal in millions of years. How do you like that? We have no scientific proof or evidence that if you encase an object into coal, that somehow coal is the perfect preserver of artifacts. Yeah, how do you like that one? So we have no reason to believe that. We have no reason to believe that an item would not degenerate even if it was encased in coal. We have no reason whatsoever, no scientific reason to believe that coal is this perfect preserver. I mean, what even is that as well? I mean, if this object was dated, hundreds of millions of years ago, like a lot of these objects in coal are dated, what you're telling me is that somehow coal literally magically preserves artifacts. No problem. I mean, that's an amazing outcome as it is, and nobody even talks about that kind of a situation. I mean, you've literally just proved that coal is the answer to all preservation, if this is the case. Why aren't we encasing all of the stuff we want to keep in coal? Because apparently coal will save your artifact for all time, right? That's not how any of this works. The only way something like this would be valid is if somebody had come out of the woodwork and shown us, hey, look, I have experimental evidence that proves that not only does coal take 100 million years to form, or 300, 400 million years, it gets out there. But not only do I have scientific evidence of this, and it's testable, but we also have scientific proof that coal preserves artifacts entirely without any degradation or very little degradation. Had somebody come out with that kind of proof, fine, that would be different. Guess what we have, though? We have none of this. There is no such thing. We have no scientific evidence or any kind of a reason to believe that coal would preserve like this. So now when we look at coal, we have no choice but to, at the very least, question mainstream geology's version of how coal is formed. We have to scientifically question that authority. We have no choice. The evidence is right in front of us. We cannot blindly just listen to these geologists who throw out these hundreds of millions of years dates and stuff like that and just blindly believe it. In these two videos alone, we have shown enough scientific evidence that proves that the mainstream does not understand coal formation. And then, of course, the artifacts that we discover hidden within coal adds an entire other layer of problems to the mainstream geological version of coal formation. All right, okay, you guys get it. My point is that whenever you start dealing with stratigraphy and you find coal, what I would recommend is go looking for catastrophic stories from cultures from around the area and see what they describe, whether it be a book or an oral tradition, whatever. Go dig around and see what that ancient culture says, or the ancient history of the area. See what it says about catastrophism. One of the pitfalls you're going to run into there is that you are obviously going to find immediate catastrophic stories. That's unavoidable. It does not matter where you go on this planet. Once you reach back to a certain period of time, all surviving cultures have these stories. So you're going to run into them regardless. So it's easy. The problem, though, or the main pitfall you're going to have to be wary of, is you're going to have to watch out for the dates that are put on those stories. And even worse, you're probably going to have to be careful to watch out for how those events are spread. So one of the tricks that we find nowadays is that we find these stories are now being kind of chopped up, and they're being stretched across anywhere from 100 years to a millennium. That's kind of what we found in the Dark Ages and in Greek chronology. We find it all over the place. But the pitfall is this. If there was one major catastrophic event, let's just pretend, it doesn't matter what catastrophic event, but there's a lot of stuff that would go on in one of those events. It's not just, say, a tsunami that happens. It's going to be a tsunami, a hurricane. You're going to have earthquakes. You're going to have the sinking of land masses. You're going to have pestilence. And you're going to have all of this basically simultaneously. One of the revisionists' things that they do nowadays is they'll take all of those events, and instead of staying true to the original story, i.e. they all happened simultaneously, what mainstream will do is they will spread that stuff out. And the reason why they do it is twofold. The first reason is most mainstream historians, they can't comprehend that all of these events would be synonymous with one another. That's their first problem. All right, so their ignorance is their worst enemy in this situation. But then it gets worse because the people who maybe go beyond that and they actually figure out, hey, look, these stories actually do appear to have happened simultaneously. There's going to be mainstream people who will come to this conclusion, by the way. But here's the next problem. Those people are not going to take up the banner of the alternative research community who are making the claim that they did indeed all happen at the same time. They're going to spread those events across a wider chronology. So instead of having an earthquake, pestilence, comet, blah, blah, all this stuff happening at once, now what we find is we find, okay, yeah, there was a comet, in 10 AD, and then there was a pestilence in 100 AD, and then there was an earthquake in 135 AD, and it just goes on, right? And then you get 1,000 years of garbage history that never existed. And the mainstream authority can do this because your average person has a difficult time psychologically believing that all of these kinds of events could have happened simultaneously, and that they could have happened to our ancestors that lived only a few thousand years ago. The psychological breaking and conditioning is real, and it's something that not only we have to watch out for, outside of ourselves, but we have to look inside of ourselves too, because we have all been affected by this psychological conditioning. That's the truth. There's no way around it. It's always hilarious when I see people think that they're above being psychologically conditioned. Not even close. If you're a human, you have the ability to be psychologically conditioned, and you have been psychologically conditioned to believe very specific things. That's just the fact. Once you admit you have a problem, then you can start to, figure out and fix your problem. And that's the point of these garbage videos, right? So we can bring up the question of coal here. We can call out the mainstream, and we can poke holes in their theories. Once you do that, at the very least, you should now be convinced that the mainstream's version of how coal seams are created are at least questionable. Even if you're not 100 on board with me, that's fine. Just go do more research, but just stay objective when you do it. And don't forget that all of this artifact evidence exists. You can't ignore this. And the fact that archaeologists and geologists and historians have ignored this, that's pretty much all the proof you need that those people are not operating in a scientific, or I should say an objective scientific way. They're not doing it. And this is your proof. Pretty much all of my videos are proof that the mainstream authority has no interest in actual scientific truth. This is just more proof of that. So just keep that in mind whenever you're studying this crap, because you can't trust these people. These people are not interested in the truth. It's very important to remember that. All right, enough schizo garbage. Okay. All right, so we're done with coal. All right, we get it. There's artifacts in coal. It probably, you know, coal is not that old. Great, fantastic. That means that we can prove that there were advanced civilizations only a few thousand years ago, which of course overturns the entire mainstream chronology, which then opens the door for real chronology. And real chronology is one hell of a ride. And we'll do stuff with that later. All right, you get it. All right, I got stuff to do.